One of our values in Peace Catalyst International is that we are committed to living with wisdom, integrity, and boldness in a globalized world. Now, what do we mean? First of all, the term globalized may be new for some of you, but basically it combines local and global. What happens at a local level impacts things globally. What happens globally impacts things locally. So we prefer the term globalization. Now, this particular value is really important to us because we work with Muslims. And the whole Christian-Muslim things brings tension, challenges. And some of what I'm sharing is my personal story, my journey away from traditional missions into becoming a peacemaker. And I think I've learned some things that can help us live with this wisdom, integrity, and boldness in a globalized world. Now, what do I mean in globalized world? First of all, we live in a post-9/11 world. Terrorism is a painful reality of the 21st century, and it looks like it will continue full speed ahead. That's part of the world in which we live. Secondly, we live in a Googleized world. You can do a quick Google search, find anything about everyone. I remember I had a friend, I'll call him Joe, who had a PhD in history from a British university, was living as a follower of Jesus, wanting to share his faith, share the gospel in Egypt. And impeccable credentials, PhD. He went and Googled his name once, and it said missionary to Muslims. He was not very happy about that. And part of that reflects this kind of duplicity, this dual identity that so many people who work with Muslims, especially in traditional missions, face. He was the mighty missionary at home. He was the scholar in Egypt, and he lived with this tension. And this is the challenge we face living in this Googleized world. Another example, a simple internet search outed 2,600 CIA operatives. Now imagine if the CIA, who specializes in being undercover, is outed, how much more followers of Jesus from around the world. We live in a post-9/11 world. We live in a Googleized world. We live in a pluralistic world. We live side by side with different races, religions, multicultural, multi-religious world. I remember walking down the street where I used to live in Arizona when I was a U.S. director of Frontiers, and this little girl came out right down the road, right on the same street. And I was so reminded that we no longer try to reach people out there or communicate out there. We live side by side with our religious neighbors, and we need to learn to live with wisdom, integrity, and boldness in this globalized world. Now, I want to tell a bit about my story. I was teaching at Columbia International University. I was the international director of Frontiers, and this was January of 2002, right after 9/11. So a journalist wanted to take my course, Church Planting in the Muslim World. I said yes because he wrote amazing things about evangelicals, very positive. So I invited him to my course, and he took notes feverishly. He looked at every Bible verse. He engaged with the students. It was a lot of fun. But then 2 months later, this article came out called The Stealth Crusade. This woman fully covered with a cross. This was in Mother Jones magazine. It's a very progressive magazine on the West Coast. I was shocked because we live in this globalized world. What was once no problem, it would have been in this one article, it ricocheted around the world. It was reprinted in Malaysia, Pakistan, Iran, Canada, Australia. It went everywhere. And then I was invited to give interviews on 60 Minutes, Washington Post, Christianity Today. Group after group wanted to know about the Muslim world, how we missionaries or evangelicals were doing this. Needless to say, I was not happy. Not only did the cover, though, look very ominous, the Stealth Crusade, the article had very good things. It was very funny in some ways and positive, But the journalist took 2 pull quotes to be sensational, and it says, "We want to wipe out Islam. We want to eliminate Islam." I was just devastated. I said, "Oh my gosh." I wrote him, I said, "I never said any of these things." He said, "Yeah, but your students did." So that's pretty bad too. So here I was in this globalized world, leading this mission to Muslims, and really it seemed like I was on a jihad, a holy war against Muslims. That was totally not where my heart was at, what I wanted to communicate. I was brokenhearted. And during this time, I remember a friend of mine, Joseph Cummings, said, "Rick, you need to develop your own website." And this was back, in the early 2000s. I go, "Joseph, come on, that's so egotistical. I don't want to have my own website." And he says, "Well, Rick," back then we did think it was egotistical, but he said, "Rick, you have a choice. You can either define yourself or you'll let Mother Jones define you from now on." I didn't need much convincing at that point, so I got my website up and began to respond to these challenges. Soon after, I was invited, I stepped down from my role in Frontiers because I couldn't live with integrity in that role. I was wrestling deeply with how I live out my faith, etc. And so I went on sabbatical to Yale, hoping to write great stuff about peacemaking and reconciliation. And instead, there were these Muslim leaders from around the world, 138, led by Prince Ghazi of Jordan, that came together and signed a document called the Common Word. And they said, there's a common word between Christians and Muslims. We're to love the one true God and our neighbor as ourself. Let's dialogue. Well, because I had connections with people all over the world working with Muslims, they said, "Rick, help us put on the conference." So I recruited. I was a main part of putting on this conference. It was an amazing time. And during this preparation for the Common Word, John Piper posted a video where he critiqued the Common Word. Now, he didn't know the background so much, but the words he saw he didn't like, and so he critiqued it. But he said, "There are some people that I really respect, and I welcome their input, their challenges, engage with me." So I responded to John Piper on the internet, but I wrote, now I've learned some lessons, knowing that other people would be listening, knowing that my Muslim friends, secular people would be reading, not just Christians. And basically I said, "John, I agree with the end game. I agree with apostolic doctrine, but I also believe in apostolic practice, and we need to build bridges. We need to reach out. Muslims are reaching out to us based on the Great Commandments. We need to reach out and respond accordingly." So I learned a bit there. And I wrote Prince Ghazi at this time. And he's the leader of the Common Word, the main catalyst for this peace movement. And I said, "Dear Prince Ghazi, we're going to have a closed-door session, and I would like you to help us choose the right people for this kind of deep conversation." So he wrote, and he gave me a number of names. And then he said, "P.S., are you the Rick Love of Frontiers and Stealth Evangelism?" I was not happy. So frustrated. Here I was making this shift, trying to live up my faith in a way that had greater integrity, trying to run from and distance myself from the Mother Jones article. So I wrote him back, "Dear Prince Ghazi, yes, I am the Rick Love of Frontiers and Stealth Evangelism." I should have said Stealth Crusade, but that's not real popular with Muslims. And so I said, "Yes, that's who I am. And but you need to know, I did not say those things. I was misquoted. I was grieved over this. And I'm sure, Prince Ghazi, you've been misquoted by the media. However, during this time, I wrestled deeply, Prince Ghazi, with what it means for me to live out my faith, the ethics of being a witness for Jesus, following Jesus in this globalized world. And so I've changed a lot, and I'm looking forward to meeting you and working with you in the common word. So Prince Ghazi writes back, Dear Dr. Rick, so you're not the Rick Love of Frontiers and Stealth Evangelism. And then he wrote this, LOL, smiley face. So the prince had a sense of humor. I like that. And then he went on to say, you know, Rick, as I read your considered response to John Piper, I was impressed by the humility and blessing of your writing. It's hard to imagine you're the same person that was in the Mother Jones article. So that's part of my pilgrimage of trying to live out my faith in a globalized world. And I've come up with something I call 3D. That's just a way of summarizing in its simplest form. I say there's 3 dimensions to global change, and we've already seen those. A post-9/11 world. We live in a Googleized world and a pluralistic world. There's also 3 dimensions to our communication, as I'm going to explain. There's at least 3 audiences, at least Christians, Muslims, and the secular world, and we need to have one message for them. And lastly, there's at least 3 dimensions of our ministry. We have a core message, an integrated identity, and a global mandate that we need to communicate. So let me quickly summarize 3D. In the past, there were 3 worlds. There's secular, Muslim, and Christian. They were separated. We could have different messages to the different segments of society. But now it overlaps. We move from being separated to integrated, isolated to connected. So what I am proposing in 3D, we need to have one message, communicate one thing that makes sense to all 3 audiences, to Muslims, Christians, and the secular world. Paul's counsel, his command actually in Colossians 4, 5, and 6, is a great verse that should guide us as we think of communicating and living out our faith in a globalized world. He says this, be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, so that you season with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. We need to live and communicate with wisdom in this globalized world. We need to see this as an opportunity, and we need to assume that others will be listening in. And let me just say this. This is not a message just for Christians, but Muslims too, Hindus, all people are facing the same struggle. How do we communicate? How do we keep our private life out of the public sphere? These kind of things. So this is relevant to everyone. There's 3 dimensions of our ministry. We have a core message, I believe, worth dying for, an integrated identity worth living for, and a global mandate worth suffering for. I would describe it like this. In this slide, it's clear there's a core message that makes sense to Muslims, Christians, and the secular world. And for us, we say Jesus is our core message. We're a peacemaking organization. We're all about the ways of Jesus, the words of Jesus, the work of Jesus, and the worth of Jesus. So that's our core message. Then there's an integrated identity that makes sense to these other 3. For me, as president of Peace Catalyst International, I can say this anytime, anywhere, freely, and everyone needs to find an integrated identity that they can live for. And thirdly, there's a global mandate worth suffering for. It is very frustrating for me as I engage people. I remember walking in a church and they said, how can we conquer Islam? And I said, Jesus didn't say anything about conquering. He was about good news. And you hear, just as my students at Columbia International University talk about wiping out or eliminating Islam, this kind of militant language is not the language of Jesus. So for me personally, I think the best way and the way we describe our global mandate in Peace Catalyst International is to talk about blessing the nations. In Genesis 12, that's the first clear description of God's purpose for all peoples. Then in Genesis 18, blessing includes doing justice and mercy and righteousness. So there's a very strong social component. And in Galatians 3:8, Paul the Apostle describes blessing all nations as the gospel beforehand. So I like to describe our global mandate as blessing the nations. But so many followers of Jesus and so many missionaries have experienced what this slide shows. It's a dual identity, a split spirituality. They say they're living as a professor of history. They say they're doing this. They say they're tent makers or business people or educators. And I say, well, they say they're tent makers, but really they're tent fakers. And they have this dual identity of schizophrenia. And the problem with this dual identity, duplicity, or being undercover for Jesus, is that it robs people of joy. It robs them of boldness. And I think it does rob them even of integrity. So this is an important thing for me, and that's why I needed to step out of my role. And in founding Peace Catalyst International, we're just trying to give one illustration of what a 3D organization could look like in the 21st century. But this is not just about Christians and Muslims. Actually, my friend Mark Russell's written a book called The Missional Entrepreneur. And he did doctoral studies in Thailand working with Buddhists. And he found the same thing, that there were many Christians who were undercover for Jesus. They were doing business as mission in a Buddhist context. And he says they were so schizophrenic. So this kind of dualism is not just a thing that we find in the Muslim world. It's everywhere, and especially followers of Jesus. And I plead with you, if you're a follower of Jesus, let's get rid of these false identities and live out our faith with integrity. So what does this mean? To have an integrated identity, I think it means to really focus on integrity. Paul says in Acts 24:16, he's standing before religious authorities, political authorities. He says, so I strive always, not sometimes, I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and all people. Jesus sends out his team on a short-term mission trip, and he says this, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be shrewd as snakes and as innocent as a dove. The snake is camouflage. The snake is kind of undercover, low profile. And the reality is that describes what followers of Jesus have been doing in the last 30 to 40 years in reaching out to Muslims. They've been undercover for Jesus, kind of like this, shrewd as a snake. And they miss the whole thing that we also need to be as innocent as a dove that speaks of integrity. I talk about an identity spectrum here. We're wise as a snake, innocent as a dove, and we need to find the sweet spot, every person. And your sweet spot will be different than mine, but what does it mean for me to be as wise as a serpent and innocent as a dove? That's the goal, I think, of an integrated identity, finding that place where we're free, joyful, not undercover. That's an integrated identity worth living for. So, living with wisdom, integrity, and boldness in a globalized world, we talk about 3D. There's 3 dimensions to global change, post 9/11 world, Googleized world, a pluralistic world. There's 3 dimensions to communication. We need to communicate one message that makes sense to at least 3 audiences: Muslim, Christian, secular, Muslim or Christian, Buddhist, secular, whatever. And then there's 3 dimensions to our ministry. We have a core message worth dying for, an integrated identity worth living for, and a global mandate worth suffering for. That's what it means for us to live with integrity, with wisdom and boldness in a globalized world.